Good afternoon. This is Yannick and Smucker. I'm one of the co-editors of the Oral History Review, and please excuse the fly that's buzzing around in late October for no reason. Joining me today is Lana Povitz, who is one of the authors featured in our brand new issue of the review focused on ethics. And I worked with Lana as the editor for this piece, and it was just such a pleasure. Rarely do you get an academic paper that you just are so intrigued and engaged with. I mean, it read like I was, reading a great short story or an article from the New Yorker. It was just such a pleasure. I want to make sure I have the absolutely correct subtitle here off the tip of my tongue. The title is Warm Distance, Grappling with Vivian Gornick's The Romance of American Communism. And it's, I really hope our readers are enjoying it as much as I did. Thank you so much for joining me, Lana.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
So we're going to focus our conversation today on sort of an array of kind of related themes, pulling some threads out of Lana's article. But to start, I'd like you to set the stage a little bit. Can you give us a little overview of the piece that you wrote and sort of the context from which it emerged?
Sure. So first of all, for people who don't know, The Romance of American Communism was Vivian Gornick's second book. And it was published, I think, in 1978 or 79. And it was really one of the first sympathetic portrayals of American communists. And I came across this book as a grad student when I was researching the history of the left in New York City. And I was finding all these traces of communists everywhere, but it wasn't exactly what I was studying. I was studying food and hunger, but there was just a lot about communism that I was curious about. And all the traditional histories that I read of the subject were quite dry, and they didn't seem to get at what I was interested in, which was kind of the feeling, the emotion of being part of that movement. And I was doing oral history at the time, and the sort of old former communists I would speak to were reluctant to speak about it in very emotional terms. And I sort of had this desire for knowledge about it. When I found Vivian's book, I just thought, wow, this is exactly what I want to talk about, that the academic monographs are not getting at, the juice, the passion kind of. But at the same time, like, there were no footnotes and it was very narrative. And I just was like, what kind of a book is this? And I started to have a bit of a generic crisis, like a crisis of genre, from which I think I've never recovered. But it was, the more I read about Vivian Gornick and the more I got to see the rest of her work, when I like a writer, I usually read a lot of their other stuff. And I was just kind of more and more curious. And then I talk about this in the article, but I ended up chancing upon meeting her at an event. And so I asked her if I could sort of talk with her more. And that led to both an oral history interview and also me kind of poking around in the archives, her research notes for that book, which were basically archives. I mean, they were in her house, but they were quite old. And so the article ended up being, in one way, a kind of history of that book, and also exploration or meditation about the difference between literary journalism, which is what this book really is, and sort of more traditional history. Does that seem like a good putting it in a nutshell?
That's great. And I really, there is a lot on the table. This book, or your article really, it does raise so many issues, and it fits nicely in our issue on ethics, because some of this is about the narrator-interviewer relationship. Some of it is about anonymizing interviews, which Leslie Gornick did, and changed names and details, which oral historians, one of our best practices, of course, is to use, whenever possible, to use real names and to not kind of fictionalize things. And just in general, this sort of what I'm familiar with from also working with a lot of living subjects, what happens when you kind of are really like the person that you're writing about, and like, how do you maintain that distance? And it's sort of a meta thing, because you're analyzing what Leslie did back in the 70s when she was doing her research, but you were also encountering Yeah, or Vivian, I'm sorry, Vivian.
Yeah.
And you're doing that, you have the same sort of experience of like, how do I approach this woman who I'm really intrigued by? So I liked all of those levels of analysis that you brought out in the article.
Yeah, it's very meta.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a big part of why I was drawn to it. So I do want to address this. Yeah, this is an atypical academic paper for sure. And I'm pleased that at the Oral History Review, we're able to publish things like that don't necessarily fit the strict mold of academic papers. And in part, that's because we have such an interdisciplinary, both writers who contribute, but also readership, and oral history as a field, of course, comprises the professional historians, but also community organizers and activists and archivists. And so we get the whole range. And that's one of the pleasures of being an editor at this journal, is that we get that diversity of voices and diversity of forms. So I'm glad you could contribute to that. Why did you choose to write it as more of a personal narrative essay?
Well, first of all, let me say that the Oral History Review will forever be in my heart now as a result of accepting this very unconventional piece. When I almost didn't submit it. I thought, oh, an academic journal will never go for this, even though I felt it to be very rigorous. And I certainly did extensive research for it. But I guess there were a lot of things I wanted to do in the piece that I felt like having it be led by a first person narrator really allowed me to do. So for one thing, I was really excited about being able to trace the material history of the research, like of Vivian Gornick's research and my own process of researching that book, how I got to my subject, what it was like to be in her home office doing that research, and to kind of just let the seams of research, of oral history research, show where there are doubts, there is excitement, there is emotion that accompanies that process, even though it normally just has to ride quietly most of the time. It's real and it's there. And so I don't see how a conventional academic paper can really allow me to touch on those things. And also, as a reader of history, I'm always very interested in the epistemology of historical research. Like, how did this historian come to know whatever it is they're saying? By what strategies? By what serendipities? Because there's so much serendipity involved in research. And so much of that is hidden. For what? It's interesting to read about. And so I was kind of making a gamble that it would be worth it to have a kind of unconventional, sort of familiar, maybe even casual style, if it meant that I got to bring out these quite rich sort of details. Yeah. And I guess I should just say, I guess this almost goes without saying, but I don't believe in objectivity, right? Like, I don't think that, I think that there's always a writer behind these ideas, and that the more that the writer can be clear on who they are when they're writing, and this is actually an insight I take from Vivian Gornick's work, itself, that the clearer you can be about who you are when you're writing, the more you can use that persona to shed light on whatever it is you're really trying to talk about. So I think that I developed myself as kind of this curious grad student when I first started doing this research. And there's a kind of energy and curiosity associated with doing research, I think, at that stage that was important to bring in. It really explained why I was willing to go through all of these hoops to sort of get answers. And so I guess I really wanted to not let that subjectivity go to waste, I guess.
Absolutely. I agree. I love, it's the same reason I love reading the acknowledgements and the discursive footnotes in an article. Exactly. I like all of that hidden stuff. Right. And I love how you found such an effective way to bring it to the fore. So let's move into a little bit of the kind of methodological questions that you wrestle with. So what happens when you like the subject of your that you're researching? You can tell, that you are kind of fascinated by Vivian Gornick, and sort of have developed this interest in her, and I remember those nervous moments as a grad student when you like meet the famous person that you are fascinated by, and how making those overtures. So there's a great sort of a piece by Jill Lepore about historians who love too much, which I mentioned back when we were in the editorial process. So what do you think of that concept of really sort of, I mean, it's not a crush so much, but just this like real fascination with the subject matter? I agree with you that there's no such thing as objectivity when it comes to being a historian, but what did you make of it as you were working on this?
Well, I could really talk about this forever. First of all, I will say that this is so idiosyncratic and also meta in a way, but the way that the romance of American communism was reviewed by other critics was that it was a flawed book because Gornick loved her subjects too much, basically. She was uncritical of them. She moved closer to the kind of what she described as purple prose, where instead of critically unpacking something, she just upped the sentimentalism. And so I was aware of that being a flaw in the book. And so I thought about that in relation to her, and I've thought about it in relation to my other subjects. You know, there's a sort of epilogue to my first book where I talk about this. You know, what happens when you have, when you've discovered that you're forming a relationship with the person you're interviewing. And, you know, I think this, the more I think about it, the more I think it really comes down to one's personal sense of what a relationship is. And I think for me, to like or even love someone doesn't prevent me from having critiques of them. In fact, a relationship that is really secure and where there is friendship and where there is warmth, I think in that context, I'm freer to ask more difficult questions. And that lets me say more interesting and complex and rich things. To me, it's not like you like someone, so that's all you see about them. You know, I can like people who have a lot of flaws, and I do. And, you know, and I think that it doesn't, so I actually think it's a generative force. Something that I do is I try to argue with my subjects very early on in the course of meeting them, which with Vivian Gornick was very easy because we have many different opinions about some things. And I remember the first time we met, I actually talk about this in the piece. We almost immediately got into a little fight about what we understood feminism to mean. You know, she has a certain view, I have a certain view. It's quite generationally, I think, organized, what we each think of that. And you know, a guy came by, he got involved in the conversation, it was annoying, he left, then we just sort of laughed it off and we moved on. But we had an experience immediately of not being always on the same page. And I think that it's important for any working relationship, including with a narrator, to be able to weather disagreement. And I think if you can do that, it doesn't really matter if you like them or you don't like them. I actually think it's harder when you don't like them. But luckily, at least in my experience, the longer I know someone, the more I end up liking them anyway, even if they seem quite difficult or tough or disagreeable at first. Time kind of produces an affection. I also want to say, just thinking honestly about my research process, that feeling of liking or admiring a subject has given me a great energy, almost a life force, like a crush, that has really pushed me toward greater curiosity and greater rigor. You know, as long as I'm willing to see the person complexly, which is not a strength everybody has. I do think that is something that comes easily to me. It's not I can hold a paradox. It doesn't devastate me. And I think there's a way of bringing that into the conversation with someone so that they can see that even if you disagree with them, it doesn't mean you're judging them. It doesn't mean you don't like them. It doesn't mean you don't believe them.
Right. Yeah, that's a nice way of stating it. And yeah, I agree that it can create a good energy and be motivation for your project. You know, you wanna you wanna like what you're working on.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's important. So also along the lines of this relationship between narrator and interviewer, what do you think the role of time is in that relationship? You can really see it here that you're analyzing someone's work from the 1970s in the 2000s, and she's had plenty of time to create her legacy in some ways, and she's probably shifted her own perspectives from that time 40 some years ago as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's vital. Like, it's just like the role of time in any relationship. It's
Mhm.
like, what's the difference? If you think of a close friend or a lover, a partner, what did you know about them in the first couple of dates or hangouts versus what you know about them after years? I mean, it's
Mhm.
completely enriched by time. So, you know, I, I understand that sometimes research requires you to do one-offs. But in my experience, the longer I can stay with a subject, even if it's in casual contact or just kind of checking in, the more the trust deepens and the more
Mhm.
enough other kinds of social insight collects around the person, that even if it's not something they've said in an interview or if it's not something you find in an archive, there are ways of knowing things about people that just become clear as you know them longer. So I
Mhm.
feel like so eager to lean into that kind of insight. I wrote about it a little bit in my first book. I called it Deep Acquaintance. It's like this insight that
Oh.
collects
Uh-huh.
around and outside interviews with living subjects. Um, and it's a funny thing. You can't footnote everything you know.
Uh-huh.
And that drives academics crazy. You want to be able to have reproducible research, and
Yeah.
sometimes you can't. And it's like
Right.
the relationship itself becomes the source.
Yeah, I can see that. And you know, lots of oral historians have written about the benefits of like the longitudinal study where you do multiple interviews over time, and
Right.
we don't always get that privilege. But when you do, I'm sure that be interesting to see how that relationship changes and how, I mean, so much of my own oral history practice is, listening to people construct their own story of themselves, which is then of course influenced by whatever the passage of time is from when the events that are under examination occurred, and how many times they've told that story to the I mean, I have a great example of someone who, had told his story so many times, and then I went into the archival record and I'm like, this doesn't align with what he's talking about. Like, how do I align these things when one is his memories and his repetition, basically, his creation of legacy. Um,
Did you
so
ask
yeah,
him?
you're
I
not
mean, did you
alone.
ever sort of bring that up to him?
Well, I mean, it got a little complicated. I did ask some of those questions. Ultimately, this particular narrator was really did not like the way I represented him in my work, and so he kind of wrote hate mail to let me know. But that's my own experience, which has colored my view on working on living subjects. I value oral history so much, but it's sort of also a cautionary tale that I had to develop thick skin around. Yeah,
I do. I do. I mean, I haven't
yeah,
received hate mail, but I think thick skin is essential.
yeah, right,
Wow.
yeah.
I mean, what's so interesting to me is like you can sometimes have that experience. You've heard someone tell us, you read someone say that story, you've heard them tell it to
Hmm.
you, you've heard them say it in front of other people with you. But sometimes you can
Hmm.
introduce something that produces a new way of thinking
Hmm.
about it. I mean, clearly not with everybody, and some people really need their story not
Right.
to change. But sometimes you get people who are excited when their story changes and they're interested in discovering that with you
Yeah. Hmm.
when you're lucky.
Exactly. It's like that new. It's like a new frame around, yeah, the story. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just what like a good therapist will always do that.
Totally. I was working with someone a while ago, a subject who was a therapist, and we constantly were drawing parallels between what she did and what I'm doing as an oral historian.
Yeah, I can
Fascinating.
see that.
Yeah. I would love, if you ever hear of someone writing about that, I would love to read that piece.
Oh yeah, there are a couple things that people have written about the similarities between therapy and oral history, and where And how oral historians actually have to keep some boundaries at times because we
Right.
aren't trained as therapists.
That's right. That's so
Um,
true.
yeah. So many of the articles in this ethics issue that we've just put out deal with this role of trust between the narrator and the interviewer, and also the role of privacy, to what extent you need to protect the narrator. And at the same time, other fields who also use interviews as a methodology tend to keep interviewees anonymous as a practice. Um, so I should say, and you can probably tell our listeners a little bit more on this case. So Vivian Gornick changed names of the people she was interviewing and maintained at least a lot of the color, it sounds like, but
Yeah.
sometimes, change details about an individual's life. Um, is your sense that was to protect them, or to why do you think she did that?
I think that for her, I mean, we talked about this in the interview, and to some extent it's in the article too, but I think for her, the important piece is the story. She wants to tell a story that is true, not only at the level of fact, or not even primarily necessarily at the level of fact, footnote truth, as I call it, but also kind of emotionally true. And this is something that it turns out literary journalists have talked a lot about, but I didn't, when I wrote this piece, I thought I was kind of grappling with these issues, the first person to ever, wonder about this. But I think that her priority is, her allegiance is to the story. It's not to the evidence. That the things that she learns from the research are sources of inspiration primarily, which is not what we do as oral historians. And I think that's where I was able to really draw a line that was meaningful to me. Like, I am bound to stick as closely as I possibly can to verifiable facts. And she's not, and if I don't want to be, then I don't need to write as a historian. So that was helpful to see. I think partly, it's called composite characters. This is a technique of literary journalism, much debated, but it's you hear enough stories that are somewhat similar, you can collapse.
Sorry, you cut out for a second.
Oh, at what point?
Sorry, you said it was called, and then you cut out with the term. Sorry.
Composite character, which is,
right.
I think, quite a common technique of literary journalism, but you basically hear enough stories that sound enough alike that you just create a character that embodies the highlights kind of all of these different stories. So to some extent she does that. But it's funny, I teach social movement history, and you have to be so selective now about what you assign to students. You can't really, I find students won't read a whole book. They won't read multiple books on the same subject. They're not grad students. So I always think, should I assign the romance of American communism, knowing all that I know, knowing all the really good scholarly histories that are out there? And I still do. I still assign that introduction to the book, because I still think that there's a way that she does capture something about social movement participation that is only clumsily and dryly gestured at by most of us academics. So I can't really let it go, even though I know its limitations. As far as anonymity, I have occasionally made certain quotations by research subjects anonymous when I think that the person is saying something really important, but that I expect readers to judge really harshly. It's not always worth it to attribute to them. Like, the kind of fallout to their character isn't worth the intervention that it makes to say that someone said this. But of course, mostly we don't, mostly we attribute everything rigorously. And in terms of privacy concerns, I don't think that Vivian Gornick was I don't think her reasoning was about people's privacy, but my reasons for not including information or for veiling it certainly are about protecting privacy. The project I'm working on now, which is a historical biography of the feminist writer Shalom Firestone. This is a brilliant theorist and brilliant organizer, someone who had enormous gifts and talents, and who also struggled mightily with mental illness. And the last, 30 plus years of her life were, she was in and out of hospitals. She was living in serious poverty. She was very, precarious in a lot of ways. And so the story is very difficult to tell. And there's a lot of people around who really tried to help her, people who really love her, people who are really protective of her. And the more I've learned, the more these sort of gatekeepers of her story have let me in, the more I have taken on their concerns about privacy, the more protective I have found myself becoming. And, I haven't gotten that far into the writing yet, but I can already see that the experience is making me much more judicious and much more careful, full of care than I would have been. And I think I also sort of understand the point of doing oral history when I can with friends and family and, direct subjects is that it produces an abundance. And when you have an abundance of material, anything can be a story. And so I'm trying to think that if there are certain details that certain still living people want kept private, that's okay. It's not the last detail in the world. It's really a scarcity mentality that I think produces unethical or underhanded or coercive practices. And I think we need to reject that. I need to reject that. I need to say, you know what, if I can't say this thing that I want to say because it upsets someone, I'm going to take one for the team because there's something else that I can say.
Yeah.
That's how I'm trying to approach these privacy issues.
That's a good perspective. And privacy has obviously changed, tremendously back from the late 70s because, in large part because of the internet and the way we rush to throw things online, as they say, and that's certainly, I think some of that urgency to just get everything digitized and throw it up online is now we're taking the moment and taking a step back and evaluating whether that's really necessary. And oral historians, as some of the articles in this issue as well attest, are becoming more protective of our subjects, which is definitely a good thing. This leads me to this question, and it sort of concerns the role of literary journalism, which is a field that I, had read lots of times, but never had the name for until you sort of introduced it to me through this article. That's what that is. That's this whole field. And I have to admit, a lot of times journalists write about history so much better than historians do. Or at least differently, So I'm wondering where you see the border between journalism and history. This is actually a question you raise yourself in the article. You're right. We, as historians, we are all about the footnote and evidence and documenting everything. But what are the benefits of taking an approach, more of the literary journalism approach?
Well, my hope would see a kind of love child of these two genres. I think there are things about literary journalism that frustrate me deeply. And even in my conversations with Vivian, I would see how evidence didn't always matter to her, that the story she wanted to tell took precedence. And I found that and find that really frustrating. I think that you have to be prepared to change your story based on what you find. And that's something that will always endear me to history. I think we're really driven by the questions, and really open. And we really wait a long time to know what the story is. And journalists, including literary journalists, I think are under, in certain ways, more pressures than we are. They often don't have, they have to get that story out in a certain time. They have to limit the amount of research they can do. Their editors are leaning on them not to explain or provide more evidence, but actually to take things out and make things flow in a more streamlined, less complicated way often. So that's a frustration. But on the other hand, it is character driven. And I think that a lot of historians don't lean into the power that comes with developing people. I think that's what makes literary journalism such a pleasure to read. There are people in it. And,
Yeah.
I think there are historians who certainly who know how to do that, but it's not professionally, it's not the thing that the profession most wants you to do is learn, character development.
Yeah.
Or lean into deep psychological questions and emotionally textured questions that involve the interplay between the narrator and I don't know that academia is interested in that. So that brings my allegiance more over to the literary journalism, to the kind of the Janet Malcolm version of things. She's another writer who I really, whose work has been very instructive to me, even as a historian. I also think that the footnote, while it can be used to just like dryly cite other sources, is like this amazing opportunity that I think everybody could use more to just sort of be chatty about side points that are of interest, but not immediate interest. And I would just love to see more experimentation, I guess. And I think for myself, like having gotten away with writing like this, the kind that's published here, I'm not excited to go back to a kind of impersonal, neutral, objective sounding voice. It's not interesting.
Yeah,
So we'll see what happens.
I identify completely. Yeah. That's certainly a challenge I have in my own work as well, walking that line.
Yeah. Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to just add to this question. I think that literary journalists are not that interested all the time in how their subjects feel about what's written about them. Like, I don't know what kind of ethical or consent practices exist for literary journalists. I know for me, I always say to a subject, I can't assure you that you're going to agree with my analysis, but it's very important to me that you feel recognized, like that you recognize yourself in this, that I am explaining your experience on terms that make sense to you. And if not, I'm interested in adjusting the writing so that it does resonate with you as accurate. Like, accuracy counts for a lot. And the responsibility to kind of contextualize, to understand, not to judge, that's really incumbent on us as historians.
Yeah. Which that's a perfect segue to discuss the idea of informed consent and sort of the paperwork side of oral history to some extent. Again, like these are the quote best practices of oral history. The idea of informed consent, making sure the narrator fully understands how their words will be used, what you're doing, but also their release of the words to you. What do you think the role of informed consent and the release forms are, and how might it be problematic?
Oh, well, I think they're vital as a starting point. I mean, I teach oral history workshops. I always have my students create and research and understand consent forms and make sure that they talk about them with their narrators. It's a place to start. It says to the narrator that the person extracting information from you has a lot of responsibilities to you, and you should know that they know that. There should be, it's a way to start a conversation that actually has to get reprised, at least in my experience, constantly. I also think that they're very limited in what they can promise. I think the idea of informed consent, like, I don't really think that people ever know what they're in for. Especially if it's more than a one-off. If it's a life study and there are going to be conversations had over hours and weeks and months or even years, there's no way you know what's coming out of that process. And so I think that I'll put it in my own terms of myself as a interviewer. I feel like I have to stay prepared for whatever can come up. It's not like, okay, the person has signed their rights to their story and now I can say whatever I want with what they've told me. No, that would be devastating for the people. Because the trust develops, and so people start to relate to you differently than they initially thought they would. They end up saying sometimes more, or they end up saying things and then they reflect on them and think, oh, I didn't like how that felt. So for me, I would much rather be sensitive to that as part of an ethical practice than end up with some juicy detail. It's not worth it.
Yeah.
And I
No,
also
it's not
think
worth it.
it's not worth it. And it gets again at that kind of scarcity versus abundance mentality. I will say that I recently had a subject whom I had gotten to know very well and who I had, done dozens of recorded hours with for a project. She withdrew from the project after, and she had signed a consent form, but that made no difference. It doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Like, I know the reasons that she withdrew, and she couldn't have anticipated that she would feel as she had come to, and neither could I. So, it's really important not to be so literal with those documents, that they're, and I've been thinking about the difference between a contract versus a covenant, something that is more rooted in reciprocity and trust, and honestly, a kind of love, just the kind of love that develops in any long-term serious relationship where there's a lot at stake. And just not being, I think there was, when this happened, in my research, I was very taken aback. It was not something I had read about in any of our journals, like what happens when a subject withdraws and you have to change the whole project. But I think it's rich too. I actually think that there's a lot to be said for understanding that our place, we're not entitled to people's stories, actually. Even if we have the information, it's not an entitlement. And if we're really good at what we do, we have to find a story that can be told. So tough luck, but yeah.
Yeah, and I've had a couple interviewees, not to the extent of hours and hours and hours, like what you're referring to, like pull out, or at the end of the interview decline to give consent, and totally understandable. And I know it's then also this really interesting mind warp, because you, as the person who's been listening, you're colored by the hours of narration that they gave, yet it's no longer something you can quote use, at least in the not obviously not quote, but even like, what is your role then? How do you let that inform you, or to what degree can you keep your distance from it?
It's like you spoke that out of my own mind. Exactly. Like I know that's exactly the quandary, and I don't.
Yeah.
And also, if you do a project that's sort of, you leave that person's story out, but you continue on with the project, and you know that what you know is beholden to the conversations you've had, do you still continue to think of that person as a sort of stakeholder in the project? Do you show them a draft, even though you don't need their approval for your quotations? When does that reciprocal responsibility end? I also think that this experience made me much more aware for future projects of what I need the narrator to understand they owe me. Like, I mean, in this case, the person I was dealing with, I think, understood just how much of an upset this was to my agenda. And she was very apologetic about it. It was fine. But I don't think that we talk enough in terms of mutual responsibility, and, not just in terms of rights, but also responsibilities. Like, the narrator should also be responsible to the historian, and should really try to think as carefully as they can about their involvement and what that means, and not necessarily wait for months to go by before changing, or waiting to see something written before they pull out, Yeah. And I imagine this is going to be handled in these kinds of situations. This is why it's so rich to talk about, because people handle them in a million different ways. Yeah,
it's true. And it's definitely this is why ethics really are so important to the field. I think we compared to our our quote, like the regular historians that I'm sure we both know, like they don't have to necessarily wrestle with these things to the same degree. I mean, any source obviously has its subjectivities, but we're not beholden in the same way to a documentary based, text-based source. Necessarily, it doesn't have emotions.
No, and then when we're faced with having to choose what kind of source to privilege, you find a newspaper article that reports on an event in one way, and then you have someone's story that reports on it another. What are you inclined to believe? And at least for me, when there's this trust or like at least long-term rapport built with someone, the tendency to privilege the oral history source is something you really have to watch. Just because you trust the person saying it doesn't actually mean it's true. People could be very trustworthy, but have terrible memories. And just be inaccurate.
Right.
It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. They just may not remember accurately.
Right.
Or the converse, or the reporter could have made many factual errors, and you don't want to privilege the written word for its own sake. So it depends.
Yeah, just because one journalist wrote it, 20 years ago doesn't mean that's true either. It's well, this has been a pleasurable conversation. I'm sure we could go on for many more hours. But in the interest of our listeners, I think we'll call it to a close here. But it's really been a delight to speak with you, Lana. And again, I can't tell you enough how much I enjoyed working with you on this article. And I'm really so pleased to release it into the world and hope it has a lot of longevity and spurs many more interesting conversations as well. So thank you
so much. I really appreciate it.